Let's go. So hi everyone, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tram. I'm a senior engineer at Arup based in our Cardiff office. I've been working for 6 years since graduating, and my expertise is in sustainable drainage or SUDS design, and I've worked on a range of projects across the country. So I'll start with, I guess, more of a personal journey of how I got into this line of work. So I'm Cardiff born, Cardiff bred, but my mum's from Hong Kong, dad's from Vietnam. Um, but I would say I'm Welsh, and so that's the kind of bit of background to yeah, my family roots. I started off attending school in Cardiff, and so yeah, born in Cardiff and went through the education system and was really interested in engineering as a whole, probably more so the structure side after watching things like Grand Designs. Went to the University of Bath to study civil engineering, but it wasn't until a placement year with Arup in the Cardiff office that I started to find myself with a real interest in water and how using our spaces to consider our natural resources is such a valuable, needed skill in the industry, but also something that I was really passionate about. And so I got involved with sustainable drainage projects like Greener Grangetown whilst it was still getting designed. And then having come back as a graduate, there were opportunities to get involved with similar projects that build on what Greener Grangetown did. And so I put my hand up and have loved it ever since. And so not long after joining as a graduate, I was selected to be on the Future Generations Leadership Academy. So this is an initiative of our first Future Gen Commissioner, Sophie Howe, where she brought together young leaders to kind of bring them through a development program about how we can be extensions of the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner, applying the principles in everything that we do, and particularly me as a designer, lent itself very well to that. And then the images on the right, I think there's been a few talks that I've given, but I always feel a bit of imposter syndrome, to be honest. I know that there's going to be people on the call who've been in the industry for a long, long time and will probably know a lot more than me. And so, yeah, it feels a bit conflicting sometimes, but the graph below just goes to show about the majority of people I speak to, friends, family, they don't necessarily understand why we do some of the work that we do. And so it's not just speaking to the kind of top 5%, assuming people in the call and some of our colleagues who are really passionate. And it's not even to necessarily speak to some of the deniers and who are very against what we try and do. It's to try and address the people in the middle, the ones who want to do something, but they don't really know where to start, or they are interested, but they just need to be communicated to in a way that is in layman's terms and doesn't use every acronym under the sun. And so I think that's where I see my role is trying to reach that middle crowd with what we're trying to do, the benefits, and then getting that momentum as we kind of change hearts and minds. And so for a bit of context for the project, we've got different legislation, as a lot of you on the call will know. Wales-wide, we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which in and of itself is quite high level. But what's been really kind of encouraging since is other legislation guidance that filtered from this act that prioritizes well-being. And so then it translates more to industry level. And so, for example, in my line of work, we've got Schedule 3, which was enacted in Wales in 2019. And that was one of the key aspects of Wood Street Central Square. And so within the legislation, there is a process that you need to go through. And so as part of this overall project, we took through Wood Street, considering how we can apply SUDS from the very beginning, which was really important. And then this project is based within Cardiff, right in the city centre. And it is within the sweet spot of a lot of these strategies that the council has either previously or has subsequently released. And so key ones being Cardiff's active travel strategy, which fits as part of the transport white paper. So Cardiff Council have stated how we can transition to become net zero, and particularly from transport, how we do that by prioritizing sustainable modes of transport. And then more broadly, we've got One Planet Cardiff, which is it touches on other things to do with perhaps water or carbon, nature, biodiversity. And so Wood Street hopefully can be used as a precedent about how we can do some of those things, and also learning from things that maybe we could have done better to make sure that we can see these benefits and interventions done at scale across Cardiff. And so focusing more specifically on the active travel point of things, this is Cardiff Council's cycleway map that you may be aware of. And so the idea is that we connect some of the suburbs with the city centre through high quality and in some cases segregated active travel infrastructure, that being predominantly separate cycle lanes. And so that's stated as part of the transport white paper I mentioned. And then that helpful image just shows hopefully some of the achievable, if not still ambitious, stats in order to get people to make that change. And so I think one thing to flag here is that Wood Street Central Square, that small ring indicates where we sit within the city centre. And so it's slightly connected, albeit it's part of the wider strategy for improving active travel infrastructure, as well as the separate cycleways that the council has. So then focusing in a bit more onto the project team. So my specific role was the lead drainage designer, but Arup were appointed to fulfill that role and then take the project through the SUDS approval body process linked to that new legislation. And so that involved coordinating between different disciplines. So understanding how it's going to have an impact from a landscape placemaking point of view. We had colleagues, but I would just make sure it all fit in with the wider water management strategy. And then there's aspects that involved structural input and geotech design. But then from my point of view, I then sat alongside the highways designer, who was Cardiff Council in this case. And then there was also street lighting design and telematics that had to also be reconfigured as this part of Central Square. So that's part of the design phase. And then when it got to being built, which happened within COVID, which I'll touch on a bit later, Knights Brown were appointed to be the contractors for Wood Street. And so then I would be pulled in for some design queries, and we could try and understand what the problem was and figure out a solution together. And so these were some of the key objectives from the council's point of view. They wanted to make sure that the road network was going to be fit for purpose for what Wood Street was going to become. And so you can see on this image, you've got the bus interchange just to the south, which is due to be open soon. And so we needed to make sure that whatever we proposed was going to be suitable for the numbers of buses that Wood Street was going to have driving down it. We wanted to make sure that the public realm was improved. So I don't know if you knew Wood Street before. I've got some images in a sec of what it used to look like. But as a pedestrian, it wasn't a nice place to be. You had quite narrow pavements, imposing buildings right next to you, and quite a busy road, which wasn't the nicest to cross. And then I mentioned about the active travel piece, high quality cycle infrastructure, which needed to be fit within the space. We wanted to improve air quality, linked closely to the numbers of cars that were traveling down Wood Street. And then finally, it needed to be a SAB compliant design. So that's to take the project through this SAB approval process, which ran alongside planning. But we needed to demonstrate to the officer within the council that our design considered sustainable management of water. And so these are just some images to show the transformation that Wood Street's undergone in the last 10 years. So I'm from Cardiff, I mentioned. So in the 2014 image, the block of buildings, which is also in 2018, it's called St. David's House. That no longer exists, but my family actually used to have a cafe next to Shaw's, just out of shot. And so I remember in my summer holidays working there in the cafe, and then like on match days where we'd have the Millennium Stadium start to fill up, you'd see road closed and thousands of fans walk towards the stadium, and then afterwards thousands walk away. But it was really special to be able to kind of influence how this road was going to be changed for the better, having known it so well. And I remember when friends would come and visit on the train, your first impression of Cardiff was outside of Central Station and the bus station, and it wasn't the nicest part of town. And so to see how it's changed so much, but I think even looking at 2019, one of the things that stands out to me is how grey it is. And so even you've got these flashy new buildings either side, the new BBC Wales headquarters, some Cardiff Uni buildings, it really needed to have nature be brought back to the city centre. And so that was part of our remit, was looking redevelop some of the public space, that being pavements, roads, but also making it greener. So the nature of how central the project was, we came against lots of challenges. One of those being the age of the street. And so when you look through the ages of how Wood Street used to be used, it was very different originally. And so, for example, as we were doing some of the ground investigations, the contractor found broken window frames, which used to form the terraced houses, which were at a lower level. And then back in the day, those houses were flattened, but not even properly cleared. And so there was remnants of what used to be. There's also some tram lines that Wood Street used to be used for. One of the other challenges was when we were building it, any excavations that happened needed to get either reinstated or with fencing to separate people. Because when the road gets shut, we needed to make sure it was still safe for fans attending various city centre events. The image on the right was taken on Wood Street, and it gives you a flavour of the number of utilities that we were up against. And so in design, which I'll touch on in a bit, we knew where some of them were, but when it came to building it, there were a lot more that were uncovered that, well, we didn't realize or were in a different place than what we thought. And so having to navigate our designs to put them in the ground was a humongous challenge, but something that we managed to overcome. And then again, being so central, there were lots of stakeholders who wanted to say in what was going on because it would impact them, road closures, and also how the street would look afterwards. And then just to kind of add to the complication, we got hit by COVID, and that was when the contractors, Knights Brown, were building it. And so that had knock-on implications for cost and program, but I guess also had the benefit of the road actually being quite quiet when it came to building some of this, so that was good. So I mentioned the stakeholders. These are some of them. So you can see Wood Street to the south, and then we've got BBC, who were quite a key player, the stadium. And so one of the things we had to think about was terrorist threats. If someone wanted to try and attack one of these areas, what was going to happen in terms of visibility? So that was something that we had to consider. We engaged with the police. We had private development happening adjacent. So the ISG site there refers to the bus interchange. And then there was also the other buildings, which included HMRC on the other side. And so having to try and negotiate construction windows with those people was something that the contractor managed really well. And so I guess more from my experience with the project and the design, I'll touch on that briefly. And so this is the layout that was sent to us by Cardiff Council's highways team. This was the layout that would serve the bus station well, but now we needed to understand, okay, where are the opportunities from introducing sustainable drainage and nature back to this area? And so we worked with our landscape and placemaking team to understand pedestrian desire lines and where dead space would be. And so we kind of showed where potential above ground interventions could change that proposed paving. And so that was one aspect, but then we also had to consider utilities. From an opportunities point of view, we were aware of a new surface water sewer that was laid to serve the new developments within Central Square. And so this was something that was really challenging to lay within the road because of the density of existing utilities, but it created a new pipe that would connect to the River Taff, which was just to the west of our site. And so we saw that as a real opportunity. Can we make sure that that asset could receive the volumes of water we'd be putting into it? And if so, let's make the most of that rather than having to try and lay up a pipe adjacent, which I was informed by contractors from the adjacent sites that there's no chance, it's too congested. And then from the challenger's point of view, we became aware of this large gas main that ran within Wood Street. And so what that would mean is we'd have to cross over the top of the gas main. And so it meant that any of the opportunities we'd identified to the north of it were going to be much more challenging to put in because we'd have to be that much more shallow than we would have been had there been a blank canvas. And so during the design phase, a ground penetrating radar was commissioned. A survey was commissioned, which scanned where a lot of the utilities would be. I appreciate there is margin for error depending on what type of survey, but we proposed lots of trial holes across the site because we needed to confirm key things like pipes and where rain gardens, tree pits are going to go. But it was decided that because of other city centre disruptions, trial holes wasn't going to be an option. And so we had to rely on the GPR survey data. And so using that, we then proposed main pipes that would connect onto that existing surface water sewer I mentioned. And then that would convey water once it had filtered through our SUDS solutions. But in the north, we proposed rain gardens, which included kind of a vegetated system, which included trees. So that would receive water from the surface, and that would deal with the north lane of traffic. And then the southern lane, water would flow into buried tree pits. And the reason we opted for tree pits was the pavement was on the narrower side. And so we didn't want to uncover and create kind of plant beds. We wanted to reinstate paving to widen pedestrian movement as much as possible. And so there were two types of intervention that we opted to go with. And we have to try and slot that within existing utilities where the space was, where vehicles needed to move between, and try and negotiate with street light positions and traffic light signals. And so, yeah, I mentioned the different types of SUDS solution, mentioned rain gardens in the north, tree pits to the south. And so this is what the drainage design looked like for the whole of our red line boundary. So what's a bit small on screen, but the small brown squares, what we opted to do was where depth was not as much of a constraint, we proposed soil cells. And so what that would look like would be plastic crates, which would increase soil volume that would enable larger tree species to be planted, but also enable those trees to thrive and reach their capacity, but also double up as attenuation. So they could store more water, treat more water. And so we wanted to put in extra soil where we could. And in some cases that would span underneath the adjacent cycleway. What we were keen to do is stay outside of the road surface itself where vehicles would be driving directly over. And I mentioned because of that large gas main. So then there's 4 rain gardens to the top right, which didn't have soil cells. We needed to make those as shallow as possible so that we could cross over the gas main while still providing the green space and trees for that part of the project. And so to talk a little bit more about specifically the tree pits and then rain garden design, we used a combination of off-the-shelf products to try and reduce costs, but also improve ease of construction and how things would fit together. And so the site itself was quite flat, and so we needed to introduce ways to get water off the surface as quick as possible when it rained. And so one of the main methods we chose to do that was using combined curb drainage. And then at different points along that curb drainage, water would drain into the soil cells behind, where the tree would be and the roots would grow out. And then I mentioned the use of the recessed tree grill. And so a cross-section of the details that we designed was the low point was not ideal. It was actually between the cycleway and the road, further away from the tree and the soil than we would have liked. And so we needed to get water from that low point into the soil system above the top of the soil so it could filter all the way through. And then once it had been filtered by that tree pit, we needed to get that water that was now cleansed back into the main surface water sewer network, which was within the road. And so what happens is when water hits the surface, it reaches that low point, and then it's conveyed by the curb drainage back into the soil system through a pipe, either through gullies at kind of regular spacing or the outfall unit. Water would then, in kind of normal rainfall events, percolate, filter through the soil, the SUDS soil mix, and then the water that reached the bottom would then make its way back into the road through a pipe and then into the River Taff. But one thing to also draw your attention to is that there were some high voltage cables that were identified during design. And so what we proposed doing was diverting those underneath the proposed cycleway. And so recognizing what depth that was going to be, we proposed our pipework to come over the top of the high voltage ducts so that it would be above the soil. And then once it had been through the soil, it would then go underneath that high voltage duct to get back into the sewer network. And then to talk more about the rain garden details, I touched the fact that some of them would have the soil cells and some wouldn't. So we've got a deeper version and a shallower version. And so again, the detail of those looked like this. So rain garden type 1, we looked to use the soil cells which spanned underneath the adjacent cycleway. The cycleway wouldn't be loaded in the same way as the road. And so that was going to be the the better solution to increase soil whilst not being at risk of kind of structural integrity being compromised. So that was the deeper system. And then the shallower one, we were really squeezed to be as shallow as possible. And we specified trees that could deal with this, but we didn't want to get rid of the trees and just have planting. And so we were able to negotiate as much depth as possible. I think one detail to draw your attention to is the flush rain garden edging. So initially, particularly the highways team were not too sure about this option. We were going to have lots of traffic driving down this very key road, particularly when the bus station was opened. And so, if you haven't got an upstand, isn't that going to be more of a health and safety risk? And so we kind of understood a lot of the risks and then presented a solution. And so one of the challenges you have is if there was an upstand on the curb and a vehicle was to hit it, you're introducing a much greater point load on that section of curb. And the challenge of this type of edging versus a normal curb is that you don't have the soil behind the curb to resist the loads. We had loose, uncompacted soil within the rain garden. And so we needed to try and reduce those loads as possible. Because of the kind of typical behavior of a lot of the vehicles, we could demonstrate that having flush curbs wasn't going to be kind of abnormal levels of risk. The width of the curb was wide enough that there was a visual deterrent, and there were also some cat size that were introduced to provide that kind of buffer in the nighttime as well. And so after kind of addressing a lot of the risk and concerns that people had, we were able to agree that, okay, we're going to go for this approach, even though it's not really been done in Cardiff before. So that was hopefully one way of overcoming some of the what would have been a very large concrete haunching around the curb to try and minimize the footprint of that. And then the second thing to draw your attention to is for the deeper rain garden, we were looking at excavating to around 1.5, even 2 meters deep in some cases. And so how were we going to have confidence that that rain garden edging, when you've got wheel overrun from heavy vehicles, buses, HGVs, wasn't going to deteriorate over time? And so what we chose to do in this instance was to build a mass concrete wall beneath the curb. And so, although visually you wouldn't be able to see it once the project was finished, but that just makes sure that the curb doesn't go anywhere and it still provides support to the adjacent highway. One of the other benefits was that we could have kind of the increased soil volume on the rain garden side of the wall too. So yeah, those are two little things that maybe distinguish the different types of rain garden. And then to touch more on the construction side of things, it was one of the challenges I mentioned is the location, and we've got events happening right next door. And so how are we going to make sure that people aren't going to be adversely affected and we can still guarantee safe movement of people? And so Knights Brown worked really carefully about the phasing of when things would get built. There was also close liaison with Cardiff Bus just to make sure that with some of the changes to the road network temporarily, that was not going to affect bus operation across the city. And so, yeah, Cardiff Bus were one of the really key stakeholders to make sure that when it was getting constructed, it would still work. So some photos that I was able to take during construction, well, not the drone photo, that wasn't me. But one of the benefits of having a project on your doorstep was, even though we had COVID, we had one bit of exercise you could do a day. And so I'd get on my bike and get to town, and then I could meet the contractor and just see some of the progress. And it was quite special seeing some of your designs become a reality in front of you. And so the top left just goes to show the typical configuration of the soil cells. We've had an opening for where the root ball for the tree would go. And then we needed to also fit in some of the drainage chambers that were going to be part of that network. Because once the paving got reinstated, you weren't going to have access to the soil in the same way as pre-construction. So we needed to be quite careful with where we were providing access to the soil. And then I guess the top right goes to show those tree grills that we proposed. Those then got reinstated with similar or kind of similar material or like resin-bound granular fill. And so people could still walk over that whilst enabling the tree to grow. And then when the tree trunk increases, you can take out different trays so that you're not going to hinder the tree. And I think one thing the drone footage shows quite impressively is how big these systems are. And so what you might see at the end, just the tree and some square grill, actually below ground, the types, the volume of soil we needed to provide for the types of tree were on we pushed the boundaries. We made them as big as possible, essentially, from a water quality, but also tree health point of view. And so you can see how much space they do take, even though they get reinstated later on. And then talking around the rain garden construction. So you can see some of the formwork being made for that mass concrete retaining wall I touched on. And so that was going to be where the curb would sit directly above. And this was one of the elliptical, I've heard, rain gardens. The bottom right photo shows that particular rain garden post-construction. The soil cells, you can see they formed part of the rain garden footprint, but they extended underneath the cycleway. And so, again, the footprint before you put the paving back is pretty substantial, but was required to support the size and type of tree, and also to attenuate the kinds of volumes that we needed to reduce flood risk for the area. And so these are some of the really key lessons. I think first thing to touch on is the top plan shows what we'd submitted as our design. And then the bottom drone picture shows what was built. And I think one thing I'm super proud about is that we were able to put in everything we proposed. The one exception for those eagle-eyed amongst you will be the bottom right. There were 2 trees that had to be taken out, and that was because we were told that a new loading bay needed to be put in, and so those trees had to go. But I think learning from Wood Street was particularly the utilities. I knew it was going to be difficult to build, but I don't think I'd fully appreciated the number of uncharted utilities that we didn't know were there. And so what was so important was that collaboration. We had a really good working relationship with Knights Brown, the contractor. And so when they were excavating and realized, oh, things aren't what we assumed, we would then come to the drawing board, what was then on Teams because of COVID, to just understand, okay, what are the things that we found? What are the constraints? And so how can we reconfigure our solution to do the same thing, but it might look a bit different in reality? And so I guess in the drawing, they're quite neat tree pits in the south. In reality, it doesn't look like that because we just had to work around what was existing in the ground. And I think the other key thing was having a really forward-thinking client. And so the highways engineer was the kind of client-side project manager. And so what we managed to agree was some kind of hierarchy of what was priority. And so, for example, putting the trees in was very high up the list, but then the layout of the drainage pipework would be more secondary or even tertiary. And so as long as water could still drain away, how could we reconfigure locations to the things that were higher up the priority list? And that was a really good framework to understand decision making, and we had everyone working towards that common goal. And so I had to, well, maybe I didn't have to put this in, but more recently I submitted the project for some awards because I think there was an awful lot of work from the wider team. And so, yeah, we managed to celebrate some success and recognition of this project. So Constructing Excellence Wales won Project of the Year, and then last Friday went to the IC Cymru Awards. And so that was really, yeah, I think a credit to the wider team, and it's hopefully the start of a lot more of these types of projects across Wales. And so we're keen, but we know we can't do it all ourselves. And so how can we share lessons, learning, and make sure that we're always developing and making things better to see these nature-based solutions pop up across the whole of Wales, not just in the city centres, but how can we make sure that they're in positions that benefit the whole of society as well? And so I like to end on this slide just because when I got sent this footage, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool to see the project from above. But yeah, really happy to open up to any questions. Really happy to go into any aspects I've touched on. If I can't answer it, I'll get back to you, but hopefully I can.
Dan, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and hopefully not just for SUDS geeks like me. We've got a load of questions in the chat, but we're rapidly running out of time before we have to switch into leave and then rejoin. So what I'm wondering is, those who've put questions in the chat, Stefan, Jan, Jenny, could you copy those questions so in case we lose them when we come back to the discussion session. But just in case we do get cut off unexpectedly, Dan, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Let's go through the questions. So the first one we've got is from John. John, could you turn on your camera and microphone and quickly ask Dan the question? You've got 2 minutes.
Hello, that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you ever so much, Dan. Really appreciate it. My question was, what is the planned design life of this streetscape scheme? And I ask because trees take many years to grow, they spread, and they need good management as they develop their canopy. So depending on the species, you know, they may not reach their peak in provision of ecosystem services for many years, 40 to 60 years, depending on the species, if you're talking about a large street tree. So what's the planned design life of this?
That's a very good question, and I might not be able to answer completely. I think to draw on bits that I am aware of. So some of the design requirements for the drainage aspects, so the kind of hard infrastructure, we followed kind of typical design life for that. The soil aspect, as part of the maintenance regime, we did say that you would need to replace either some of the sacrificial part of the soil above ground. I think we said something like in 10 years' time, you need to replace part, if not all, of the soil within those systems. But in terms of the trees being where they are, we had planned to have those trees in to exceed my lifetime. And so that was one thing, is recognizing that the trees you see today, even though they've been in the ground for maybe 1 year, they are only just starting to establish. And so please don't kind of use that image of today as the vision that what Wood Street's going to look like 10, 20, 30, what you mentioned, 40 to 60 years down the line. And so I think, granted that the types of, or the volume of soil that we were able to provide wasn't as much as we could have done had it